our CFO at the time, Bill Smith, who I think really also was a big factor in like changing just the way I operate and the way I look at things, kind of ripped us apart after the meeting and called it like embarrassing. He basically got up and walked out of the meeting. I remember I literally went home. I cloned every sales dashboard that the sales ops team had built out in Salesforce and just started playing around with it and messing with it. But like I was up till 4 or 5 in the morning, just trying to figure out where the hell did things break.
Hey, I'm Andrew Kaplan. Welcome to the Delivering Value podcast, where I chat with folks who work in tech about the 3 toughest moments in their careers. The time when they've struggled, felt self-doubt, had imposter syndrome, or maybe received some really tough feedback. My guest today is Adam Goyette. Adam was previously the VP of Demand Gen at G2. He led marketing at HelpScout, and now he runs his own growth agency. He calls it an anti-agency agency called Growth Union. Adam joined us to talk about 3 interesting moments in his career that I think you'll find interesting and relatable. The first is at his second job. He was a mid-level marketing manager and had an intern who had an Ivy League MBA get promoted over him and became his boss after his former director of marketing left. The second moment that we talked about was when his CFO literally walked out of their go-to-market meeting because they were so frustrated that no one could explain why they had such a bad month. And Adam talked about the learning in that experience. And then the third time is when he became VP of marketing and struggled in a really high pressure environment and how he navigated that and his lessons for anyone in a similar position. His story is relatable and fun. We had a lot of fun along the way. Let's jump right into this conversation. I think you're going to love it. Dude, so here's where I figured we could start. I saw your announcement, right? I'm a fan, I'm a follower, and I'm on your email list. I saw that you started your own, you're calling it the anti-agency agency Growth Union. And I wanted to ask, like, how are you feeling a couple months in?
Yeah, it's going great, man. When you get your positioning right, you can definitely tap into something. And so we definitely got lots of inbound interest, which is awesome. But for us, it's like anything. We want to make sure we find the right people to work with because either you're a solopreneur or an agency, like everything, it's all about your reputation of how well you can actually satisfy customers. So like the last thing I want to do is bring on companies and customers potentially who weren't going to be great fits for us. And so figuring out a lot about the vetting process and who our ICP is and stuff like that. But it's going great. We've been super busy and scaling it up. So it's been a lot of fun.
And as someone who started their own gig, it takes a ton of courage to do what you did, right? You sent out an email to your whole list. You sent out a blast to your LinkedIn audience. You've got a fairly big following. And it takes courage because like once you share it, you can't unshare it, right? And if it doesn't work out, you don't want to send everybody an email saying, hey, I did this thing, now I'm doing this other thing. So I'm curious to know like why now and how did you get the courage to do that?
So I guess there's 2 things. It doesn't feel that courageous because I don't think it really is if you do the work ahead of time. If you're just blindly trying something, I think that's probably a little more dangerous. But it's not like people aren't working with agencies. It's not like there isn't this market already out there for this. So in some regards, it's not like I'm starting some new technology or new startup. That's some scary thing, like unproven by itself. But I think the question about like how are we position ourselves and how we're trying to be a little different, that's where it took a little more time to come together. And honestly, I was already working with a bunch of founders, but I probably talked to close to 50 founders before we launched it to just get their read on why do they like working with certain agencies, what they hate about agencies, what they like most, when they decide to use them, and all this sort of stuff. So it didn't feel like that. It felt like very de-risked by the time we launched because I was like, okay, there's definitely a market here. There's definitely a need. People want to work with people who have been in the seat before. The things they hate most about agencies, we're going to solve these problems directly by doing this. And so that's how a lot of our messaging and kind of positioning came together. So when we launched it, it didn't feel that risky to me.
That's cool. So you did a lot of the de-risking up front, a lot of the interviews, a lot of the things that you probably did in-house, you just applied to your own thing.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, smart. And so, dude, if we go back in time a little bit, you're here now, but I'm curious to know where you came from. Can you share a little bit about your background and your childhood and where you grew up?
Yeah. So we bounced around a little bit growing up. My dad was in sales. And so I lived primarily in Detroit till about 3rd grade. And then we moved to Philadelphia, where I grew up outside of Philadelphia and lived there until about junior year of high school. Then we moved to Connecticut. And then I went to school in Maine and then ended up back in Philly after college and then kind of bounced around. So I'm one of 9 kids as well, Irish Catholic. It's a big family. We're still all really close and tight. And so, yeah, it was kind of just one of those things where it doesn't seem as chaotic and crazy when you're just part of that life. And then you look back and like home movies now, and I have 4 kids of my own now, and I'm like, wow, that is complete insanity. My parents were psychopaths to want to have 9 kids because it is absolute chaos.
And where were you in the nine?
Yeah, I'm fourth. 3 boys, 6 girls, and I'm the fourth.
What was it like growing up with 8 other siblings?
Yeah, it was fun. I mean, honestly, there's never a dull moment. Everyone's about 2 years apart. And so at one point, my mom had a newborn 2-year-old, 4-year-old, 6-year-old, 8-year-old, 10-year-old, 12-year-old, 14, and 16-year-old in the house at one time. So it was just chaos, but fun. Yeah, I never remember like you always had someone to play with. You always had someone to do something with. So yeah, it was just kind of enjoyable. It's, just kind of a fun experience.
And what kind of stuff were you into? Like if we were to talk to like one of your friends from high school, what would they say about you?
So I was into sports a lot growing up. I played basketball and soccer, and then in high school I played hockey. So I was into sports. I hated school. I was like king of playing hooky and guilty my mom into letting me stay at home. And so I think at one point I missed like 25 days. I think in junior year where they sent a letter home. They're like, hey, he's not gonna be able to go on if he misses any more days. So school itself, I never really enjoyed. I just not the style I like to learn in. But relatively quiet though. I had a small group of friends and played sports and hated school. That's the summary.
And what would you do when you skipped?
So I wouldn't like skip. I would just pretend like I was sick to my parents. And my dad would always be like, get up, go to school. But then he would leave for work. And then I could convince my mom usually that I could stay home.
Right on. And so I hated school too. I always felt like my grades, I would get just good enough where my parents wouldn't kind of get on my case about my grades, but it was just high enough that they wouldn't mind, but low enough that it wouldn't cause too much effort for me and I could get into whatever I wanted to get into outside of it. So that, that tracks with me. What was your major in school? So you said you went to college in Maine. What did you study? What was your major?
Yeah, I went to school for journalism. And so I always liked English, always liked reading and writing. And then I went to school for journalism, but I minored in advertising. I graduated college in 2003, so a while back. And this was right at the time as like newspapers were just starting kind of the slow decline and hadn't really been online yet. And I had done some internships in college and marketing departments and stuff like that, and really liked more of the marketing side of things. So when I graduated, I didn't even pursue a degree or a career in journalism. I just went right into marketing.
That's cool. And so what was your first job kind of coming out of school? So you had a couple internships in marketing. I was going to ask you what led you from what you were into earlier into marketing, but it sounds like it happened somewhat naturally. What was your first gig?
I got a job at Sennheiser, the microphone company. I was like an associate product manager. And so I worked on the headphone line on the consumer electronics side. So I basically had to work with the big retailers like Circuit City and Best Buy and Amazon, making sure inventory supplies and then working back with the factories and shipments were coming in and then helping out with some messaging positioning. And I hated it at first. I actually quit. My dad knew someone who worked there who got me the interview and I ended up getting the job. And then about 2 months in, I went to the CMO's office and I was like, I'm going to put in my resignation. And they were like kind of shocked. And like, why? And I was like, I hate it. I was like, I sit at a desk. I have no context for what I'm doing. I'm just working on these things. And like at the time, like I think I was just being given tasks and projects without much context. And I'm just sitting in this cubicle doing these things. And it was miserable. And she said, well, don't quit. Come back tomorrow and let's talk. But back the next day, we had a conversation. She's like, all right, it was 2 weeks. We're going to see what we can do. And I ended up staying there for a little bit over 2 years and it was great. And so I'm glad she convinced me not to quit.
Wow. How long were you into working there when this happened?
I was like 2 months in, maybe about 2 months in, not even. And I think the person I was reporting to ended up being great, but at the time was super busy with everything going on. And so when I could join the team, I had very little guidance and first job out of college. And it was like, I was just being given like random tasks where it'd be like, go in. It was none of the fun kind of creative marketing stuff. It was more all the grunt work that he didn't want to do is what it felt like. And I was like, this is not what I want to do with my life. So luckily it turned around.
Man, first jobs are tough, dude. I mean, I listened to that and I'm like, oh, that was like my first job too. And I remember telling my parents and they said something like, well, welcome to working or something like that. And I was like, oh man, and quitting never crossed my mind because I don't know. I just figured this is what everybody does. They just work a job and I'm at the bottom of the totem pole and I'm going to eat a bunch of crap for a while. And at some point, maybe I'll work my way up. And so I love that, dude. So you went in, you tried to quit. They talked you into staying. You end up having, a fairly long run there, huh?
Yeah, I was there for a little bit over 2 years. Yeah, I wish someone would tell, or would have told me at least early on that your job actually gets more fun the further along you go. So that's like the worst your job's ever going to be is probably right out of college, your first month, to be honest with you. Because like from there, you don't know what you're doing. So there's all this like unknown, but also you really can't start working on like the more fun things or aspects of marketing until you get enough experience that you can actually get to that level. But I found the higher you go in your career, the further you go along, the more opportunities you get to work on all the fun, cool stuff that you would want to, or people talk about. I just thought like, oh, am I going to be doing this for the next 40 years of my life? Like, no, thank you.
Yeah, dude, I feel you. I think it's even harder nowadays with a lot of people's first jobs being remote. I have a younger sister. I remember when she first started her first professional job, it was fully remote. She is bottom of the totem pole. And being fully remote, you miss all of the connection and like normalizing that kind of happens when you're in an office. And so it was only the tough stuff and none of the good stuff. And I remember talking to her and she was just having a really tough time thinking all the things that you were thinking, but maybe even more extreme versions of it, just trying to get comfortable in the working world. It's hard.
Yeah, I can only imagine remote and not feeling like any sort of connection to anyone.
Dude, so tell me about some of the bumps along the way. Maybe we can start with what's one of the early challenges in your journey?
So I would say one of the low points or one of the early challenges I had in my career was I just kind of naively assumed doing a good job is enough and that people just recognize it. And so I remember one time I was working at a company and our marketing director had quit and I was like a marketing manager. So I was managing all the automated campaigns. And this is for like a database of, I think like 4 million people. So we were running tons of campaigns and I was kind of managing all of it. And it was a smaller team, relatively smaller startup. And the marketing was like 5 people at the time. And so our marketing director ended up leaving.
This is not at Sennheiser, right?
No, no, this is after Sennheiser. After Sennheiser, I actually went to this small company, not tech really. They did corporate relocations. And I was a 2-person marketing team, learned a ton, was there for about 4 years, and then went into kind of tech from there. And so this was in one of those jobs. So I was doing a great job, but it was, 2 founders and it was a smaller company. I just kind of assumed like, okay, she's left. I'm probably going to get promoted or at least be considered for it. And what happened was kind of the next week, they announced that the marketing intern who had been our intern the summer and it was joining full time, they were making into the marketing director. And she came
What?
with like Ivy League kind of background, pedigree, but like no marketing skill set. And I was just completely floored by that. It was one of those points where I was like, what am I doing wrong here that I'm not even being considered for this or getting promoted? And what I really realized in that was like, and this is not a knock against her, first month or so, I was just completely negative about it, right? Like it's hard to look past or get over your own feelings, even like ask yourself, like, what did I actually do wrong here?
What was your job at this time? Sorry I just want to contextualize what was going on.
Yeah. So I was like a marketing manager. I oversaw all the Marketo at the time, all the email campaigns and things we were running there and worked on some of the rebranding stuff we were doing, just kind of like generalist marketing things. Because it was a relatively small team. We weren't real compartmentalized at the time. And so she was just a person on the team, had joined like a month or two prior full time, but was viewed very fondly by kind of the founders and stuff. And what I realized is like she just did a 10 times better job than I did at just internal marketing and just being seen and making like what she was working on. She would tell the founder and she would send him an email saying like, hey, here are the things. And like, didn't necessarily just go through kind of chain of command. Whereas I was just like, okay, my boss knows I'm doing a great job. I'm assuming that's enough. Everyone probably knows I'm doing a great job. That's enough. I don't need really do anything else. And what I realized, like, man, I didn't do any internal marketing or selling when we would run campaigns and we would get big upsells or run these things. I was just like, oh, my boss knows about it. So that's good. And like wasn't trying to get more visibility necessarily. And I think that ultimately like that came back to bite me in that situation because they were like, well, we're not really sure what you're working on. You've been here for a year and yeah, if everyone likes you and you're doing good things, we think, but like nobody really knew just because the founders aren't getting into the back end of Marketo and seeing anything. And they're just seeing kind of the results marketing's driving and not necessarily how it's tied to me. And so that was kind of a big moment for me where I was like, man, I don't want to be in this position ever again where it feels like I just had something like taken from me that I felt like, oh man, that was going to be mine to have. Feeling so blindsided. I just felt like, man, where did I miss the dots here? Because I missed something big.
Jeez, man. And so did you report to the intern? Did they become your boss after this?
Yes.
And so now you're in kind of a weird situation, right? Because you're at this point, you said you're at Sennheiser a couple of years, you had a little stop in between. So now you're years into your career. You think you're doing a good job. You're getting some good feedback. You've got this intern who joins the team. Are they an MBA intern or just Ivy League undergrad?
MBA intern.
Okay, so MBA intern who comes in. You've got more domain expertise than they do, but it seems like in retrospect, they did a great job of kind of some of the softer skills or communication and managing up. And so what goes through your head when they get promoted to you and you have like your first one-on-one with this person?
Well, I wasn't mad at them necessarily because I thought, well, good for them. I wasn't mad at her. I was probably nicer about it. Just that she also like acknowledged, I think, the awkwardness of it in our meeting. And I was like, well, it is what it is. You're at no fault for getting promoted. Like, it's good for you. There was never any contention between the two of us or anything like that, because to me, that wasn't the thing that bothered me the most. So there was no contention there.
And did you know that she was doing those things or doing a better job at some of the internal marketing and managing up, or is that only with the benefit of hindsight?
Only with the benefit of hindsight, probably. Because like at the time, my boss, if she had to promote someone, would have easily promoted me. So to me, it was like, okay, the person who should be happy, my boss, who I'm reporting directly to, is happy. So I'm doing a good job there. I wasn't thinking like broader, and also just how quickly startups can turn over and things change, of how important it is to have like other probably touch points within the company.
And your challenge is one that I think a lot of marketers, especially technical marketers, have been through, where a lot of the most important work is invisible to many other people, right? If you were killing it inside of Marketo and you had all these branches and flows and segments built out and you were measuring everything to the nth degree, nobody knows that unless you're letting everybody know. Same thing if you're a demand gen person and you're spending a ton of time optimizing campaigns and digging into cohorts and doing all kinds of analysis. And so the challenge here is one that I think will resonate with a lot of folks. What does internal marketing, how does that change for you after this?
I think the biggest thing is I started celebrating my wins like publicly. So like you said, in demand gen, if we did campaigns, we were the whole month, we were testing like an upsell campaign, and we were able to get typically 1% conversion rate off these campaigns. And because of the testing we were doing, the different offers, we got a 2%. Translate that into what does that look like from a revenue perspective? And then here's what we've been working on this month. And so for me, it was way more about like the show and tell of everything. And even actually showing off the losses, like the experiments, right? Because I think one of the things I realized is it's about how many kind of at bats we're taking too. And so showing like, here's all the things we're trying really helps with the perception of like, oh, this person is really owning their expertise. They're owning their domain, right? They're owning email marketing and they're owning demand gen, and they're doing all these kinds of testing experiments to find out what's going to work best for us. But you have to tell people you're doing that stuff. If you're just doing it kind of in isolation, like, it doesn't change the results necessarily, but it changes your own career. And I think it also changes not just, when opportunities present for promotion and things like that, but also I think back on it and it's like, oh man, if I had gone to them, could I have unlocked way more resources as well to make me go faster? If they had known like, oh, I didn't realize we were doing all these experiments or all these tests, like, hey, what would happen when we paired you with a designer for a month so you could just start running these things, right? And like the fact that they can just make those decisions, like I was selling them short by not sharing this information with them, because I think the number one thing for most of these founders, they want to grow, they want to scale, they want to go fast. And if I was an opportunity to do that, I wasn't giving them the chance to see that. And so I think that was a big miss on my end.
That's kind of beautiful, though, reflection that you just shared. Thinking back on it, is this one of those moments that's like really painful in the moment or confusing or frustrating or whatever, but actually ends up being sort of one of those pivotal moments in your career?
Yeah, it was definitely a big moment for me. I feel like I changed a lot in the office, like of how I worked after that, right? I became way more like, okay, I'm going to start sharing a lot more and talking about a lot more of what I'm working on. But also, yeah, I wasn't just going to be kind of like a passenger on my career. Is kind of what I felt like before. Like, whereas I'm doing good work and I just go home and then that should be good enough. Reality is that that's just not how the world works.
This episode of the show is brought to you by AppQues. If you work in product-led growth, you know how important activating and engaging new accounts is. Helping those new accounts get set up, experiencing the value quickly, and then continuing to engage them deeper is super important to your success in a product-led environment. My team spent years focused on this when I was leading growth teams in-house, and I know how hard it can be. And it's why I'm so excited that AppQues is sponsoring the show. They're the leading product onboarding and adoption platform for web and mobile apps. And they created the Product Adoption Academy, which is where you can go get a free masterclass, think courses, templates, examples, etc., to help you level up your product chops. And if you haven't already, check out my Value First onboarding course in the Academy, where I share the exact framework my team's created that helped us onboard and activate hundreds of thousands of new users during my time at Wistia. Check out the Academy at appcues.com/product-adoption-academy or my personal Value First onboarding course at appcues.com/value. I think early in my career, I sort of looked down on the people who were sharing a lot, the people that were standing up every show and tell and every presentation. And like, I sort of looked at them as like, oh, these are people who are like bragging in public, or geez, here's another presentation from that same person. They're going to be up there again. And then when you really lean back and you look at it, those are the people that tend to get just what you said, more resources, more promotions. And it turns out it's actually a really important skill to thrive at different levels of your career. The more senior you get, the more you need to bring people along in the journey. And so typically you get the learning in a painful way, like in the one that you shared, but it's a huge learning for a lot of us.
Agreed. And I think the further you get along in your career with teams and stuff, it's less about you being the one standing up and more about getting your team to be the one standing up to say like, hey, you should be sharing this, like post something in all hands, right? Slack channel and share like the test you just ran and so the results we got and helping them like see the value in doing that and really propping them up to kind of be the hero. Because if you're the CMO doing that, so then maybe I think you could make the argument like, oh, this person is trying to be front and center with everything. Like ultimately you should be celebrating your team and letting them have those big wins. I think once you get further along in your career, but yeah, for sure. I think those are the people, similar vibe where you look at that as like, oh, they're bragging or God, they always have to be kind of the one up on stage kind of thing. Right. And like, I'll let my work speak for itself. And it just doesn't work that way. There's too much going on. People aren't going to really realize what you're doing or not doing.
Yeah. And what I've realized is if somebody has to say, hey, what are you working on and why are you working on it? You're fucked. Right? Like when somebody asks that question, it's usually in the context of things that are not pleasant and not good going on and resources that you're not going to get and projects that you're not going to be able to get off the ground. And so I've learned it's an important influence tool, which is kind of what I heard you share as well for your own career, to be a driver and not a passenger. As you continue on, is that the only tough time or like tough feedback that you've received, or have you had other moments that you've received tough or frustrating feedback in your journey?
I would say I had tough feedback at one point in my career. So when I was at Booker, I was there for 2.5 years or so. And at the time joined as like an IC and then ended up managing the acquisition team. And so would go into these weekly kind of go to market meetings. And generally when they're going well, they're going well. So I think like I was always presenting the marketing side of demand, like here's how much traffic we're getting, here's how the site's converting, here's the leads, all this sort of stuff. And then sales would kind of present their side. It was fine. And then we kind of hit a time where sales weren't growing. And it was like a 3-month kind of dip to the point of like, we had one of our worst months ever. We were driving 250 contracts a month typically. And I think we dropped down to like 71 months. It was like August and it was just like a horrible month. And we had a meeting and I like presented the marketing side of it and sales presented their side of it. And at the end, it was like a lot of frustration and kind of felt like finger pointing to be like, well, we drove the leads, but nobody could actually tell the full story. And our CFO at the time, Bill Smith, who I think really also was a big factor in like changing the way I operate and the way I look at things, kind of ripped us apart after the meeting and called it like embarrassing. He basically got up and walked out of the meeting. I was like, this is embarrassing that we have one of the worst months in company history. You're the teams responsible for this and nobody can sit in this meeting and tell me why exactly this happened. It really stung. Like I'm a very competitive person as well. And so I hated that feeling of like, oh man, we just got crushed. We just lost. I remember I literally went home. I cloned every sales dashboard that the sales ops team had built out in Salesforce and just started playing around with it and messing with it. I think I was up to like, not even joking. This isn't supposed to be like a hustle hard story, but like I was up till 4 or 5 in the morning, just trying to figure out where the hell did things break. This is pre-kids too, by the way.
Yeah. I was going to say, no way you could do that now. You might be up at 4 or 5 in the morning, but for other reasons.
Yeah. And the next morning, it bothered me so much. I went into his office and I had put together like, hey, here's what I actually think is going wrong. And it wasn't like crazy, but basically we were looking at it just too high level, right? When we actually cut into it, the leads we were driving were 2 SMB. They were like 1 to 2 person type of companies, not the 5 to 10 SMBs we sell to. And that made up a big mix one of our campaigns drove a ton of leads that ended up getting disqualified. Sales connect rates dropped. There's all these different things where it's like, hey, here's the top 7 reasons I think of what went wrong, and here's why, and here's what we can do to fix it. And it was awesome because he sat with me for like 2 hours and kind of broke down like, okay, here's how I would look at it, and here's how this. Basically, in that meeting, we ended up forming what was like the go forward kind of way we started looking at it and reporting on it. And like when I left, like 2 years later, the person who took over on my team was still doing it in the same way, working with him and stuff like that. And so it was very cool to see, but I think it definitely changed the mentality I had where it's like, okay, marketing did their part. Here you go, sales. And so I viewed it way more full funnel, like, oh, I guess it makes sense. You should ultimately, as the marketer, care about the revenue and the outcomes. And I know that's like popular now to say, but at the time it was more like, hey, marketing is doing their job. This is kind of like the heyday of the MQL. I would say the golden era. We drove leads.
Right. And you were hitting them, right? What I'm hearing you say is we were hitting our goals on the marketing team. So we stood up in the meeting, chest up, chin up. Hey, we're doing okay on our side. It's not an our problem thing. And then it sounds like through this painful feedback and sort of this change moment, you changed the way that you thought about that, more collaborative and more full funnel, more focus on revenue and outcomes, less on the inputs. Is that fair?
Yeah, exactly. And also like nobody cares about your own individual goals if the greater team doesn't hit it, right? And so, I think the approach should have been like, hey, if marketing truly did everything they did and hit all of our targets and sales miss, even then, I think now I would still approach it differently and say like, hey, actually, here's what we did last month, but here's what we're going to change, even if it's just doing more to try to help sales because we're seeing this drop because the close rates drop because we added 20 new reps to the team. And so there's some inefficiencies there now on the sales side. So how do you help them solve that problem, right? So thinking beyond just where the marketing kind of line typically ends.
And did that change your relationship with Bill moving forward? Because he walks out of the meeting. It obviously bothered you. Of course it would bother anybody, but it bothered you enough that you stayed up late and then the next day you didn't let it simmer, right? It sounds like you hit it head on and you went straight to him and said, hey, here's kind of what I see. Did that change your relationship with him? And if so, how do you think it changed?
Yeah, it changed a ton. We started having weekly one-on-ones.
With the CFO, that's pretty unusual for a marketer. That's cool.
Yeah. And I wasn't like the CMO either, right? Like I was the director of acquisition at the time. And so we started having weekly one-on-ones where I would basically review what we were going to review in the meeting and almost strategize with him. And so it was very cool.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's very cool. Like, here's what we're seeing. Also, I think a big part with him was like, hey, help me help you. So basically, let's have a meeting before so I understand like what are the things and I'm educated. So if there are problems you're seeing in the funnel, I can help drive home these points, right? So it was awesome. It definitely changed our relationship. And so he's someone that was super impactful for my career.
And out of curiosity, did your sales counterpart do the same thing?
So sales ops, staying up super late.
Well, I don't know if they stayed up super late, but
We did know. So the sales ops definitely was digging into on their side to try to figure out what was going on. But yeah, I think one of the big things is like, don't ever go to those meetings and blindside the other person or the other team, right? And so I think one of the things I realized too is like we were going to those meetings because nothing was going wrong and we were hitting the targets. Like no one really cared. But then part of it is like, hey, we're one team. I need to understand what's happening on your side when it's good or bad. And even when it's good, what are the bad things that are happening, right? And same with my side, because I think one of the pain points was the data we were showing and the data they were showing weren't matched up, right? It was like marketing showing this and we're showing this. And so a big piece of that afterwards is really like, okay, we have to be connected. And it's not 2 separate teams here. It's really one team.
yeah. Can you contextualize the meeting? Like how many people are in the go-to-market meeting and who are those people roughly?
So our CEO, CFO, CMO, and CRO. And then I think we had like 4 VPs of sales ops person, and then like 2 or 3 VPs of marketing and like me.
So a bunch of senior players.
Yeah. So it was like 12 people probably total. But yeah, it was like the executive go-to-market team.
So you're in this meeting with at least 12 people, 4 of them are C-level and a bunch of VPs. What goes through your head when the CFO walks out? Like, I'm just trying to put myself into that meeting. If I was standing in your shoes, what would go through my head?
Yeah, I was just kind of sitting there like, holy shit, like this is what normally happens at these meetings when they go ahead. It was definitely one of those moments where it's like you're trying to read the room, but also not say anything that's like, because I'm also not the most senior person on the team. So it's like, I'm not going to step up necessarily and just like blurt something out. So I was just kind of like, okay. I'm just going to kind of be quiet and I don't know, follow whatever the CMO does here or says. But yeah, going forward, that was the meeting that basically I would end up running because I was showing all the data. And so I would walk everyone in the room through the data to start the meeting. And that's how the meeting started going from there on out, which was awesome.
Yeah, that's cool. And who talked first after the CFO walked out? Do you remember?
I think everyone just kind of like got up and ended up like leaving too. Like the CEO left and I was like, all right, let's meet back end of the week. But like, you guys need to figure your shit out kind of message. And then I was like, okay, I think we went back to our CMO's office and chatted for a little bit. I was pretty much meeting over at that point.
I got it. Okay. So it wasn't like this one person left and then the rest of you had to awkwardly figure out how to restart.
No. Yeah. It was like, okay, I think the meeting's over at this point.
That's wild, man. I look at someone like you as really impressive, right? You just started your own agency, but before this, you've had some badass roles and you've been a growth advisor at a bunch of different companies. I think it would be easy to look at someone like you and someone with your experience and think you must know all the answers or you have some intel that the rest of us just haven't figured out yet. And I'm curious to know, do you ever struggle with self-doubt? Does it feel that way on the inside?
Yeah, no, it definitely does not feel like I have all the answers. And I feel like if anything, the last 42 minutes have taught us, it's that I do not have all the answers. I think the biggest thing is you have to be honest about where you are. So I always want to learn what other people are doing and what people care about and all this sort of stuff. And every company is different. So I think figuring out a growth strategy at one company is not the same at every single company, even if they're in the same vertical or same space. And so really it's about understanding that company. And I think the biggest thing is you have to be okay with just being really curious about things and asking stupid questions or whatever it might be, but try to soak up as much as you can. Sometimes people come into roles and they try to pretend like they have all the answers, and you're just shooting yourself in the foot when you do something like that, because 6 months, a year from now, you actually should have a lot of the answers at that point if you've done it right. But if you're coming in like you have it all figured out, when you don't know those answers, it actually is bad at that point, right? That you don't know whatever it might be in a year from now. So for me, it's just like, it's supposed to be fun, I think, marketing. And we're not saving humans here. We're just building like software and tech. And to me, I think it should be more of a fun role. And I just kind of approach it like that, and almost like it's a little bit of a puzzle to figure out and game, which makes it feel a lot less stressful. My wife's an ER nurse. And so like she has real problems at work.
I remember that. My first job, I worked at this big ad agency I graduated in '08. So it was like banner ads in their heyday. And I remember running some campaign and Disney was my main client, which is kind of a cool first client to have for my first job. But I did something stupid. It's like I had a $2 million campaign going to a 404 landing page type of thing. I just didn't do QA. Borderline in tears going to my boss. I just wasted all this money. And he was like, look, man, this isn't the hospital. We're not first responders. Nobody's going to die over this. It's going to be all right. And so it sounds like you have a similar perspective, even a little closer to home, because your wife is a first responder and is someone who's trying to keep people alive. I think it's good perspective.
Yeah, it's not that serious, most of that stuff. And one of the things that I also do is like, I just look at situations that I think, okay, what's the worst case scenario? So like, even when you were like, okay, you started your own thing, worst case scenario in my mind is like, it doesn't work. Let's just go get a job. I think I can still get a job, right? If it doesn't work, I'll just go apply for a job in 6 months and get a job. And so like people make up these scenarios or feels like a bigger thing. And if you just think of like, well, what's the worst thing that could happen here? It's usually not that bad.
Yeah. And so we're talking a little bit about self-doubt. And I'm curious to know if there's a certain role or chapter in your life where maybe you struggled a little bit more than other times.
Yeah. I would say my first VP role, I struggled. And so I went from Booker to a Series A startup. And at the time, it was my first VP role, stepping into it, managing like all of marketing. And it was a super stressful environment. We didn't have a ton of runway left. It was a management team that was filled with people, first time founder, not from tech background, all this sort of stuff. And it was just like a pressure filled environment, like crazy pressure where it's like, we need to hit these numbers or like we're going to lay people off, and just a very kind of like toxic environment it turned into as well. And so I think the company, when I first joined, didn't feel that way. And very quickly, as we struggled to get some of the motions going, it turned into just a very toxic environment where there's lots of fear around people getting fired. You could go into the office and you could just feel the stress. It was like also one room, New York office, one boardroom, which was just a glass boardroom. If you were in the office, you could see the office, the one meeting room. And there's always like stressful meetings happening, screaming, arguing. And it just was like, felt like, man, this is the most stressful environment ever to be in. And so I think in that process, I went from a place like Booker, where I felt like I was crushing it and had really great relationships with everyone and we were growing. And I was like, okay, this is gonna be the next step in my career. And then I was just like filled with tons of doubt of like, man, am I even good at this? It was a struggle the whole time. And it made me realize I wasn't suddenly a bad marketer. I suddenly didn't know not how to do acquisition or growth. But back to the kind of point I brought up earlier is every company is very different. And so there's great marketers at bad companies and there's bad marketers at great companies. One of the things I work with lots of founders now hiring. And one of the things I say is like, don't fall in love with someone because they worked at some brand. Everyone knows that marketer who's like, oh, X, whatever, insert company, big name company. You're like, man, how did this person ever survive there? And the reality is some of these companies, they have momentum. And the reason I was successful in my role at Booker, where it felt like I was crushing it, was it wasn't just me crushing it. We had an amazing sales team. We had an amazing sales ops person. The marketing team was really good. We had a good CMO. So I had like all these things that make my life way easier. We had a good brand, all these things. And then when you take a lot of that away, it doesn't mean I'm less effective, but it makes it a lot harder to grow. That was a hard position to be in because a super stressful environment to be in. I was also having my first kid at the time. My wife was pregnant at the time. So I was the only one making money. So it just felt like, man, this is like the world's kind of coming down on me. And yeah, that was definitely a hard one. But then leaving that company, it kind of made me realize, oh man, it was just really the environment that I was in there because the next position was not like that. No, I just tried to be a lot smarter about choosing where I worked and who I worked with.
I think that's a great takeaway. What's your advice to someone who's listening to this right now, who's working at a company, who's feeling the pressure because things in tech have slowed down, or maybe the funding has dried up, or their boss is stressed about finances, so that stress is trickling down? What's your advice to someone listening in one of those positions?
I think the biggest thing is like you have options. A lot of times it can feel like I'm stuck here or whatever it might be. But I think start exploring your options a little bit and see what's out there. But also just having those conversations going will make you feel a lot better, whether you decide to or not make a jump. But you're in the best spot ever, probably now, being fully employed, where you don't have to necessarily jump on something. And so I think that was the other thing was I don't ever feel like I'm in some rush to just take a job. So part of my advice would be like, hey, make sure you're doing all the networking stuff, you're connecting with people, talk with other marketers. You and I were just chatting before we started recording about the power of networking. And really, when I say that, it means like, I know Andrew, we've chatted before, we've talked on LinkedIn, all these sorts of things. So now it's like, well, if I had an advice or if I wouldn't do something, you're someone I could send an email to or pick up and call. And I have a lot of people in my network like that. And I don't ever stop doing that. I try to do at least like a weekly call with a random person or a marketer or someone for a bunch of different reasons. One is just to have a big network of people that could truly help things. So we talked about the agency and de-risking it. I also had a bunch of marketers I sent the messaging to and had them give me their thoughts and opinions on it. And so like Eddie Schleiner is a good friend. We worked together at G2. So like he's someone in my network who I had hop on a call with me for an hour and help me break down the copy and how to do it and all this sort of stuff. So I think if you're in that position of making sure you're taking time to still build for yourself, because if you look at the product as like your career, you have to do what's best for you. It's not just about what's in that moment. So I think you should always be doing kind of the health maintenance things for your own career, which to me is like making sure you're connecting with other people, having conversations with recruiters when they come up. Like I always said yes to every recruiter if they had an opportunity. And most of those never panned out to be anything. But I still have a recruiter who actually last week passed over 2 companies who were looking for a VP of marketing, but they're having a hard time filling the roles. So they want to bring in an agency now. And this person never placed me, but we had conversations a bunch of times in the past, right? And so it's like, you never know where those networking opportunities or relationships kind of take you. But I think making sure you're just constantly kind of doing that work, because I think it's the biggest thing.
It's such good advice. I feel like the number one thing I hear from folks that don't do this is they're like, I'm just like too busy. I know I should do that. I probably should do that. And so I love that. Thinking about it in the broader arc of your career, thinking about all these investments and all of these relationships that you can build, it's often not clear how they're going to pan out or be helpful to you down the road. What's nice is that you have the option if and when the time is right and you do have an ask. Now you have all these people that you've already formed real relationships with. I feel like people love nothing more than to help somebody. And so when you reach out and you have a specific thing like, hey, I have this thing, I could really use your help. Here's what help looks like. they want to say yes. And so that makes us feel good. And so that's cool that you've really been proactive and recommend that folks be proactive in forming those relationships. I love that.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing in my entire career that I found is doing those relationships, having those relationships is just a crazy unlock that people don't realize. And it's not about how many likes do you get on LinkedIn. It's about like actual conversations, engagement with people, right? So I think people get the two conflicted when they think of like building your network, that they think, oh, I need 50,000 followers on LinkedIn, or I need to get this level of engagement on my post. And you really don't. It's not about that really at all. It's about actual relationships with people. And to your point, so many people, I would send emails to them like, hey, I'd love to chat about you, what you're building here. Or, hey, I saw you posted this. Would you have for a 5-minute call where I can just pick your brain on one thing about this campaign I saw you share something about or whatever? And most people are more than happy to talk about themselves and talk about what they're working on. Like they enjoy that, but you get tons of value out of someone doing that.
Yeah. If you could go back in time, what's one skill that you wish you worked on sooner?
I think the end outcome kind of conversation we were talking about with the learning at Booker, if I had known kind of tying myself to the end outcome a lot more early on, I think that's probably a big unlock. Cause I think it just changes the way you look at marketing and changes a little bit about the way of how I would approach things. And so I would say like getting closer to what are we reporting to the board? What does the CEO care about? What does the board care about? And understanding that funnel and what are the metrics that they care about is a big unlock. A lot of people talk about it, but there's nobody that really ever educates you on that sort of stuff, right? Like nobody ever sits down with you and says like, hey, marketing associate who's been here 3 years, let me walk you through the board slide, what these numbers are, what they mean, and why they care about this. And if people did that more, it's a big unlock because it's like, oh, now I see the bigger picture. And one of those people, I just like to know like the why behind things. And so I think that would have helped me a lot.
And how can somebody do that without having to have the CFO walk out of their meeting?
Yeah. Yeah. Stage the worst career.
Yeah. How can we skip that part?
I mean, I think people are lucky now because there's so many resources online and things you could find. Probably like you could search an article or a YouTube video and probably find people breaking down like some of these metrics and stuff. But also like, I think if you just wanted to have a conversation with someone, you can ask your CMO like, hey, can I see the board deck you guys are sending this month? I'd love if you would be willing to just walk me through it. I'd love to understand what's going into it and why. Unless you have the world's shittiest CMO, like they should sit down with you and walk you through that. And so I think some of it is like career mapping. Okay, here's where I want to go with my career. And back to your point about helping people, it's like having that conversation with your boss. Say like, hey, ultimately, like I want to be a CMO. So like I would love it if you could start showing me some of the ins and outs of what you're doing and the why. So you get a better understanding. And most people are willing to share that and kind of walk you through it.
I feel like most associates or marketing managers are nervous to ask that. They're like, well, I don't want to bother my CMO. They're really busy and probably, they don't have time to show me that kind of stuff. And I feel like the opposite is actually true, where the CMO is like, oh, I'm so happy that this person is doing this. This is the exact kind of person I want to have on my team. I'm going to invest in this person because they're able to think big picture and ask questions and think 3 steps outside of their immediate domain. And that's a huge value on a team.
Yep, agreed. I think the biggest thing is they don't want to feel like their time's being wasted. So like, I think if you're going to make an ask, it has to be a genuine ask and it has to be thought out a little bit. It just can't be some half-assed kind of thing you shoot off and then you go to the meeting and you're like, oh, okay, cool. Like give it some thought or do some homework on your own. So maybe the more specific you can get with your ask, the better. Right. And so I think if you're sending out networking emails that are like, I'd love to pick your brain about what, if it's like, hey, Andrew, I noticed you have this podcast. I love the way you interview. Would you be up for a 10-minute call where I can just understand a little bit how you structure the calls and some of the prep work you do to get to these answers? You'd be way more willing to get on the call with that person because you're like, okay, they're not just the pick your brain kind of thing. It's like, is this gonna be a sales pitch? Is this like actual real interest? And so they've already done some legwork to like indicate they're truly interested. And then I think you'd be willing to help. And so the same thing applies to your CMO or whoever, your CEO. I think the more specific you can get in your request, the better.
Yeah, it's great advice. I feel like when you ask someone to pick their brain, you're really asking them to do a bunch of work right there. If they say yes to that, they show up to the thing, whatever it is, in person or remote, and then they're kind of listening to figure out like, what is this person getting at? Like, what's their motivation? What are they struggling with? what do they want from this interaction versus if you're able to shortcut that and do the work for them. Here's what I'm looking for. It makes it way easier for the person to say yes, to provide value in getting you to that place that you're hoping to get to. And it's a better fit for both sides.
Yeah, agreed. And I think people don't like going to calls, like you said, on the fly. I do way better if you can give me 5 minutes of thought. So I could say like, okay, here's what we're going to be talking about. And I can think about it when I'm in the shower that morning or whatever about how to give you like a real answer versus like on the spot, just asking me some question.
Dude, I got 2 more questions for you and then we'll wrap. So I'm actually curious to know. So you're going to pick up your kiddos. We're filming this at 11 a.m. Eastern. Where are you picking them up from? And what are you listening in the car once you get them in the car?
I'm in the UK right now. So we moved over this summer to the UK. So it is 3:00 here. They're out of school at 3:30. So it's my 8-year-old daughter and my 6-year-old son. They like the Ramones, so they'll listen to the Ramones. They have been listening to Eye of the Tiger a lot lately. And then Crazy Frog is the other one I think they listen to a lot. So lots of randomness in the music picks.
That's really fun. Well, dude, thank you for coming on, sharing your stories, sharing your journey, a few of your bumps along the way. For folks who are interested in hearing more about you and your perspectives, where should they go?
You can follow me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best spot where I share most of it. And then if you are interested in Growth Union or working with us, if you go to growthunion.co, you can find out more there.
And you have a Substack as well, right?
Yeah, the Friday Growth Note. Yeah, I write a Friday newsletter every week.
Which I'm a subscriber to. We'll put links to all that stuff in the show notes. Thank you for coming on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the pod. I hope that you enjoyed the episode. If you did, the biggest gift that you could give me as a small business owner and as a content creator would be a review. You know the game. You can go on to Apple Podcasts. You can go on Spotify. Leave a review. That would help me service this content to other folks who are like you. Obviously, you should subscribe to the content if you really dug it. And if there's feedback that you have for me, folks you think I should chat with, stuff that you wish I would gloss over faster, whatever it is, I'm all ears. I work in growth. You're not going to hurt my feelings. I try to collect feedback and iterate quickly. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn at Andrew Kaplan or on Twitter at @akaplan. Otherwise, hope you enjoyed the episode and I'll see you next show.